Senator Mason.
Yeah, thanks, Acting Deputy President. Acting Deputy President, as we come to the fag end of the 43rd Parliament, it's a good time to assess the government's failures. Now, many of my colleagues have mentioned some of the failures, because none of us are sure that whether it's Mr Rudd or Ms Gillard, Rudd-Gillard governments, it doesn't make a lot of difference. Same policies, same failures. Same horse, a different jockey, Acting Deputy President. Over the last few weeks, my colleagues have spoken a lot about the mining tax, a tax that, very strangely, raises no money. Imagine the Labor Party doing that. You actually have a tax that raises no money. That's the mining tax, one of the gross policy failures. And of course, another great policy failure, of course, Acting Deputy President, is the world's largest carbon tax. The world's largest carbon tax that will have no impact on the climate. What an appalling policy failure. Another one. The world's largest carbon tax that will have no impact on the climate. Thirdly, another appalling policy failure, of course, has been the asylum seekers, the boat people. We had a policy under the coalition government, under John Howard, that worked. Mr Rudd, the new Prime Minister, the Rudd Redux, Acting Deputy President, he's back. Restoration Rudd, he's back.
Order.
He
Senator
was the
Mason,
Prime Minister.
You know you should refer to members in the other place by their appropriate title.
Well, I apologise, Acting Deputy President. When Mr Rudd was Prime Minister, he thought it would be a good idea to soften John Howard's successful boats policy. Why did he do it? Because he thought we were heartless. We had no ethics. It's this pathetic moral vanity that has undermined Australia's borders. That perhaps is the greatest policy failure of the Rudd and Gillard governments. An appalling policy failure to expose our borders. But I actually want to speak about, Acting Deputy President, something that you can't always see, that Labor and the Greens want to forget, that's sometimes a little bit harder to touch. My colleagues today have spoken a lot about the fiscal failure of the Labor Party. They've spoken about the enormous debt, the $178 billion in debt, and an enormous fiscal failure. The fact that the interest bill on that alone, Acting Deputy President, would pay for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. They've mentioned that. We've heard so often about the great cash splash where people bought flat-screen colour televisions, you'll recall, sir. We've heard so much about the overpriced school halls over the years, and also about the Pinkbacks fiasco. We've done that to death, nearly. We've done that to death. And my colleagues have done a superb job in holding the government to account on that fiscal failure, sir, of public debt. I actually don't want to speak to that. I want to speak about public debt, but I want to speak about the moral failure of the government and public debt. The moral failure. Let me get to it. We on this side, Acting Deputy President, have always known that social democracy, well, is a bit of a con. It's a bit of a con. Essentially, social democracy is a pyramid scheme. It's a pyramid scheme. Not only sanctioned by the state, but eulogised by it. Social democracy is all premised on this assumption, that the number of taxpayers and national productivity will continue to grow at a sufficient rate to support growing social welfare. Social democracy is premised on the fact that the number of taxpayers and national productivity will continue to grow at a sufficient rate to support growing imposts on the Treasury, growing social welfare. That's what this side, their underlying economic assumptions, are based on that. Social democracy breaks down if either of two things happen. Acting Deputy President, either the number of taxpayers or the productive output of a nation is insufficient to meet the obligations made by government. Either the number of taxpayers or the productive capacity is insufficient to meet those obligations, or where the obligations keep increasing because of increased life expectancy, something states can't always expect. What has been happening in the West, in the developed world, for at least the past 20 years, is that both these scenarios are happening. There are not enough taxpayers. There are not enough taxpayers left in the developed world. And we are not sufficiently productive to meet our ever-expanding welfare demands. The economy is not sufficiently productive, and there aren't sufficient taxpayers to meet the increasing imposts on the government for social welfare and recurrent expenditure. This lot has to believe that because that is what they premise their entire political beliefs on. So, how has the West, how has the developed world, Acting Deputy President, what have they done to meet these welfare demands, these growing welfare demands? What have they been doing, sir? Well, they can meet them by borrowing money to pay for them. They can borrow money to pay a welfare bill. You borrow, put on the credit card to pay for a welfare bill and pay for recurrent expenditure. You can do that. You can go into debt. You can go into debt. You're going into debt. And also by shifting the obligations from the generation that receives the benefits to those who will not. Let me just explain what I mean. You're asking, in effect, to future generations, your children, Acting Deputy President, and your grandchildren, to pay the public debt that our generation is now racking up. Let me just quote from Professor Neil Ferguson, The Great Degeneration, How Institutions Decay and Economies Die, based on the BBC Radio 4 Reith Lectures for 2012, sir. He says this: the heart of the matter for the Western world is the way public debt allows the current generation of voters, that's us, sir, to live at the expense of those as yet too young to vote or as yet unborn. We spend their money, we spend their inheritance, you see, Acting Deputy President. He goes on to say that this mind-boggling debt represents nothing less than a vast claim by the generation currently retired or about to retire on their children and their grandchildren, who are obliged by current law to find the money in the future. They've got to find the money in the future by submitting either to substantial increases in taxation or to drastic cuts in other forms of public expenditure, i.e. in welfare. What we rack up on the credit card, your children, your grandchildren, sir, will have to repay. We are living at their expense throughout the developed world. This is not just a fiscal failure, Acting Deputy President, it is a moral failure. He says this. He goes on to quote the great conservative Edmund Burke, Acting Deputy President. I know you are a great devotee of Edmund Burke. He says this: the enormous intergenerational transfers implied by current fiscal policies, we see a shocking and perhaps unparalleled breach of precisely a societal partnership. What he says is society is more than just us, the voters. Society is more than just us, the voters. Society includes those who cannot yet vote, and those yet unborn. Edmund Burke recognised that all those years ago, in the 18th century, sir. He recognised that we govern not just for ourselves, not just for our current generation, we also govern for our kids, our grandchildren and those yet unborn. And this is a moral test. It is not just a fiscal test, it is a moral test. It is very easy for us to rack up debt. Let me tell you, it is easy. This lot has done it better than anyone else in the history of this country. The Labor and Green Alliance has had the five largest budget deficits in Australian history. It's not just a fiscal failure, it is a moral failure. What we have to understand, Acting Deputy President, is that governments, any government, governs not just for today, it governs for the future. It governs for the future of our children and our grandchildren and those yet unborn. And that connection between the generations is the heartbeat of our country. We are responsible not just for the next rent seeker wanting more welfare, not just for another industry asking for protection. Every time we decide to spend more money, we have to decide whether that debt is worth putting on the loan book of our kids and our grandkids. And I just wish, Acting Deputy President, I just wish Western Europe and the United States had thought about it. Because I tell you what, I know, even in my area of universities and research, I would love to be able to spend more money on universities and indeed in research. And in a way they create much of the productivity innovation for our country. But every time a government makes a decision about spending more money, it must ask this question: does this assist our kids and our grandkids? We cannot allow ourselves to wallow in financial profligacy that has totally undermined the capacity of Western Europe and the United States. When I hear arguments on the other side of the chamber from the Labor Party and the Greens that, look, it doesn't matter, you've got to spend a bit to get a bit. That's exactly the argument that has been used throughout Western Europe and the United States since World War II. The second the taxpayers can't raise sufficient tax, the productivity starts to fall, guess what happens? Debt starts to rise. And despite the fact that this government has raised debts that have never been before seen in this country, there is no argument that was all done for our kids or our grandkids. No argument at all. Does anyone actually believe that this government would ever return our budget to surplus? Does anyone believe that? Even more so, Acting Deputy President. Does anyone actually believe that the Australian Labor Party and their Green allies would ever actually start paying back public debt? They don't even believe it themselves. They would never pay back public debt because they think it's not a bad idea. The difference between Australia and the developed world and the rest of the developed world is not the Labor Party, it's the coalition. If the coalition hadn't won 2 out of every 3 federal elections since the end of the Second World War, I can make you this promise with an absolute certainty, Acting Deputy President. This country would be in systemic debt, just like every other social democratic country on earth. We'd have a debt ratio not of 8% or 9%, to be 30 or 40 or 50 or 60% of GDP, without any doubt. The difference between the fact that our country overall has a low public debt, no thanks to them, is the fact that the coalition has won 2 out of every 3 elections since World War II. We are the only difference between Australia being like the rest of the world, with very high public debt. And if you don't believe me, just look at the history, ladies and gentlemen. Just look at the history. Never, not once, since 1901, since our nation came into being, every time Labor leaves office, and this has been the case since the creation of our country, Labor has always left us further in debt. Always left our country further in debt, and there is not one exception since the first Labor government, John Christian Watson, in 1904. There has never been an exception. I hear the other side going, oh, well, you know, sometimes you've got to fight a world war, Brett, so you go into debt. Sure, you have to fight a world war, you go into debt. But you know, it's never changed. Whether Labor governs in good times or bad times, or during peace or war, always there is more and more public debt. And there has never been an exception in 110 years since the first Labor government. It is their greatest disgrace. Sure, they've failed miserably. They've failed miserably with asylum seeker policy. I accept that. We all accept that. The moral vanity of Mr Rudd is absolutely appalling. And sure, their carbon tax is absolutely pathetic. Like so many of us here, and I can see some friends of mine here this afternoon who fought against the carbon tax. The only way we'll ever cut emissions worldwide is through multilateral action. If the G20 decides to do something, Acting Deputy President, but to act unilaterally, like the Labor Party did, is ridiculous. There is no way Australia acting by itself and having the world's largest carbon tax will have any impact on climate at all. Zip, as Mr Rudd would say. They are appalling policy failures, all of those. The mining tax, of course, it raised no money. The carbon tax and asylum seeker policy, all shocking failure. But the greatest failure actually is the public debt, is the moral failure. This side, the Labor Party and the Greens, always talk about social justice. And everyone on this side is sick to death of hearing about how they believe in fairness and equity and justice, and the Coalition doesn't give a damn about fairness and equity and justice. That's what they always argue. The greatest moral failure of the Labor Party and the Greens, I swear to you, Acting Deputy President, will be the debt that this lot imposes on your children and your grandchildren. And they will do it because they have done it since Federation. And they have never, ever changed their spots. So when you have now the new Treasurer, Mr Bowen, and Mr Rudd now recast himself again as an economic conservative. Remember, he was an economic conservative, he was a social democrat. Then, of course, when he ran for office in 2007, you'll recall he became an economic conservative, Acting Deputy President. And then, of course, he abandoned economic conservatism because of the global financial crisis, became a born-again Keynesian, a born-again social democrat. And then he realised just one very important thing, Acting Deputy President. He realised that his entire political beliefs were wrong. He argued, his economic belief was this, that only social democracy, only Kevin Rudd, really, only Mr Rudd, really, could save capitalism, could save liberal democracy. And what have we learnt in the last 6 years of this Labor government? What have we learnt about the world economy? We have learnt that the only people that can save social democracy, the only people that can pay for their spending are the Liberal Democrats, are those that believe in entrepreneurial activity, entrepreneurship, business and capitalism. In the end, in the Western world, capitalism and entrepreneurial activity will have to save social democracy. That's the change. This lot, under Mr Rudd, argued the only thing that will save the United States and Western Europe will be social democracy. Now we know that's wrong. The only thing that will save social democracy is liberal democracy. He even got that wrong. So not only is his economic theories, of course, he's abandoned them yet again for the third time. He's changed his economic clothing 3 times. But it's worse than that. It's the shocking moral failure of Kevin Rudd and the Labor Party. If I believed, Acting Deputy President, even for a second, that this lot would start paying back public debt, would force our generation, my generation, to live within its means, just like householders have to live within their means, I would give them some credit. But I know, Acting Deputy President, they have absolutely no intention of living within their means. They'll throw out largesse and try to win votes. They'll promise the world, and they'll put our kids and our grandchildren in debt. And that's the great economic, the great social and the great moral failure of the left, not only in Australia, Acting Deputy President, but in the Western world. So when it comes to the next election, our party is not just seeking to govern for our generation, for you ladies and gentlemen, we are seeking to govern for your kids, your grandkids and children yet unborn.